Two people compete for the same position with identical qualifications. One follows every rule, submits perfect applications, waits for responses. The other bends procedures, leverages connections, creates strategic advantages. Guess who gets the job every single time? Most people believe fairness creates level playing fields where everyone succeeds equally. Why do people who bend rules always seem to get ahead? Fair play appears valuable because it builds trust and maintains social order. But what if the entire concept of fairness serves those already winning? Think about the last promotion you didn't get, despite deserving it. Did it go to someone who played politics better than you? The fairness trap operates by convincing honest people that rules apply equally. If you want to understand why playing by rules keeps you behind, subscribe to Prof. Zhang Explained and share this with someone following every regulation. They need to see why fairness is a luxury only winners can afford. The system creates different relationships with rules depending on your strategic approach. When we say fair competition, we mean different behaviors based on advantage. For fair players, success means following established procedures and waiting for recognition. They trust that hard work and honest effort will eventually receive rewards. They believe systems reward merit and that patience creates sustainable advancement over time. For strategic players, success means understanding which rules matter and which don't. They focus on results rather than processes and bend regulations when beneficial. They recognize that systems reward leverage rather than merit consistently over time. Think about whether you follow rules or optimize outcomes in competitive situations. Consider the difference between playing correctly versus playing to win effectively. This explains how different approaches to competition affect long-term success and achievement. The difference isn't about morality versus immorality, but strategy versus naivety completely. But here's where it gets interesting about rule systems and competitive advantage mechanisms. The trap doesn't just encourage rule following instead of strategic thinking effectively. It actually prevents people from recognizing that rules serve those who created them. When people follow rules religiously, they accept disadvantages that rule makers design intentionally. This creates what economists call systematic bias, where honest players lose consistently. Meanwhile, strategic players understand that rules exist to benefit rule creators rather than participants. Consider how often rule followers receive promised rewards versus how often rule benders succeed. Does following procedures actually lead to advancement in your experience? The fairness trap becomes sophisticated when examining how it handles competitive environments completely. Fair-minded people typically assume others share their commitment to honest competition. This assumption prevents recognition that competitors use every available advantage regardless of fairness. The honesty assumption creates what psychologists call projection bias, where people expect reciprocal behavior. Fair players reveal strategies while opponents hide tactics and exploit openness. Meanwhile, strategic players gather intelligence while protecting their own methods and approaches. Do you share your strategies openly or protect your competitive advantages carefully? What happens when you trust others to reciprocate your honesty consistently? The fairness trap exploits what behavioral economists call rule reverence in competitive psychology. People develop emotional attachment to following procedures rather than achieving objectives effectively. More rule attachment creates less flexibility and fewer opportunities for advancement. This reverence prevents people from recognizing that rules often favor incumbents over challengers. Choosing rule compliance over strategic advantage often produces people who lose consistently. Meanwhile, strategic people understand that winning requires adapting methods to circumstances rather than procedures. The fairness trap creates what sociologists call moral superiority complex, where following rules feels virtuous. People derive satisfaction from honest behavior, even when honesty prevents achievement. This satisfaction prevents recognition that virtue doesn't guarantee victory in competitive environments. Moral feelings also prevent people from learning from successful competitors who bend rules. Meanwhile, strategic people focus on effectiveness rather than approval from others consistently. They can adopt winning methods rather than maintaining losing moral positions. The fairness trap creates learned helplessness, where people accept unfair outcomes rather than fighting. Fair players often rationalize losses by blaming luck rather than recognizing strategic. This rationalization prevents learning how successful people actually operate in competitive situations. Helplessness becomes problematic when people cannot adapt strategies to overcome systematic disadvantages. They continue using methods that fail rather than adopting approaches that work. Meanwhile, adaptive people change tactics based on results rather than maintaining consistency. But something more sophisticated happens with fairness concepts and social control in competition. The trap doesn't just encourage rule following instead of strategic thinking about advantage. It creates moral pressure where strategic behavior feels wrong, even when effective. Society develops beliefs that fair play represents virtue, while strategic play represents this moral framework prevents people from using effective methods, because methods feel unethical. The pressure also creates guilt about winning through strategy rather than merit. Meanwhile, successful people understand that competition requires strategy rather than just effort. They can use effective methods while others limit themselves through moral constraints. The fairness trap handles what economists call information asymmetry, where knowledge advantages determine outcomes. Fair players share information freely, while strategic players control information carefully. This sharing creates disadvantages because information sharing benefits competitors more than sharers. Information control also ensures that strategic players maintain advantages while others operate blindly. Meanwhile, naive people believe transparency benefits everyone when it actually benefits recipients. They can lose advantages rather than building them through information management. The fairness trap also exploits what psychologists call reciprocity bias in competitive relationship expectations. People expect others to return fair treatment and become disappointed when expecting. This expectation prevents recognition that competition involves taking advantage of opportunities, including others. Reciprocity illusion also prevents people from protecting themselves against exploitation by strategic competitors. Meanwhile, realistic people understand that competition involves self-interest rather than mutual benefit. They can protect advantages rather than giving them away through misplaced trust. But there's something even more sophisticated happening with fairness beliefs and competitive positioning. The trap doesn't just prevent strategic thinking through moral constraints about methods. It creates systematic disadvantage where fair players serve strategic players' interests unknowingly. Fair players often provide resources, information, and opportunities to competitors who don't reciprocate. This service creates what economists call value transfer, where honest people work strategic. The transfer also prevents fair players from accumulating advantages necessary for competitive success. Meanwhile, strategic people accept advantages from fair players while protecting their resources. They can accumulate benefits rather than distributing them through misplaced generosity consistently. The fairness trap addresses what behavioral scientists call competition illusion, where people misunderstand games. Fair players believe they're playing cooperative games, while strategic players understand competitive. This misunderstanding creates systematic disadvantage because cooperative strategies lose in competitive environments. Game confusion also prevents people from adopting appropriate strategies for actual rather than imagined. Meanwhile, realistic people recognize game types and adjust strategies accordingly rather than consistently. They can compete effectively rather than cooperating in competitive situations disadvantageously. The fairness trap also exploits what economists call moral hazard in competitive behavior patterns. People take excessive risk with honesty because they believe fairness protects them. This protection illusion prevents recognition that honest behavior often creates vulnerability in environments. Moral confidence also prevents people from developing protective strategies necessary for competitive success. Meanwhile, cautious people understand that competition requires protection rather than just honesty. They can defend advantages rather than exposing themselves through naive transparency. But perhaps most devastating involves how fairness beliefs affect competitive learning and development. The fairness trap creates competitive fragility where honest players cannot handle strategic opponents. The fairness trap works by providing moral satisfaction while preventing competitive effectiveness completely. It allows people to feel virtuous while remaining unsuccessful in competitive situations. The system provides ethical comfort while preventing strategic development that creates actual achievement. People experience moral satisfaction while losing competitive advantages necessary for advancement significantly. Meanwhile, actual success requires strategic thinking rather than just rule-following behavior. The trap perpetuates because fair players who succeed often had advantages enabling victory. They become advocates for fair play while overlooking strategic elements enabled. The successful examples obscure people who achieve results through different approaches completely. And remarkably, the fairness trap has convinced people that rule following equals virtue. When examining competitive outcomes, reveals that strategic behavior often produces better long-term. Fair players need strategic thinking rather than just moral consistency for success. The fairness trap represents effective mechanisms for converting competitive energy into moral rather than strategic advantages that create actual advancement and success in realistic competitive environments. Understanding this trap doesn't mean abandoning ethics, but recognizing competitive realities and requirements. It means developing strategic thinking while maintaining core values where possible. If you want analysis of how competitive systems favor strategic players, subscribe to Prof. Zhang Explained. Share this with someone who always follows rules perfectly. They need understanding why fairness becomes disadvantage in competitive environments that reward strategic thinking. The fairness trap also creates what economists call opportunity cost blindness in competitive decision-making. People cannot calculate the cost of honest behavior versus strategic alternatives effectively. This blindness prevents recognition that rule following often prevents advancement more than rules protect. Cost blindness also prevents people from understanding how strategic behavior creates compound advantages. Meanwhile, calculating people can evaluate honest versus strategic approaches and choose methods appropriately. They can optimize outcomes rather than optimizing process adherence for moral satisfaction. Consider how your commitment to fairness affects your competitive outcomes over time. Does moral consistency produce better results than strategic flexibility in your experience? The fairness trap exploits what psychologists call social approval dependency in competitive behavior patterns. People choose honest behavior partly to maintain approval from others who value fairness. This approval prevents recognition that social validation often conflicts with competitive success. Social dependency also creates what behavioral scientists call audience capture, where behavior serves observers. People perform fairness for approval rather than optimizing for competitive advantage and achievement. Meanwhile, independent people prioritize results rather than approval from others who aren't competing. The fairness trap creates what sociologists call moral signaling, where honest behavior demonstrates virtue. People use rule following to show others their ethical standards and moral superiority. This signaling prevents recognition that virtue signaling often replaces effective competitive behavior. Signal focus also prevents people from developing skills necessary for competitive environments that reward strategy. Meanwhile, results-oriented people focus on capability development rather than moral demonstration for audiences. They can build competitive advantages rather than just displaying ethical standards. But there's something even more sophisticated about fairness concepts and competitive environment design. The fairness trap doesn't just prevent strategic thinking through moral constraints about methods. It creates environments where strategic players can exploit fair players systematically and predictably. Fair players create predictable patterns that strategic players can anticipate and exploit. This predictability gives strategic players enormous advantages because they can plan around behavior. The exploitation also prevents fair players from achieving competitive parity through effort. Meanwhile, strategic players remain unpredictable while exploiting others' predictability for competitive advantage consistently. They can maintain strategic flexibility while others follow predictable patterns disadvantageously. The fairness trap handles what game theorists call cooperative defection, where cooperation gets punished. The fairness trap also exploits what economists call market inefficiency, where fair pricing gets undercut. But perhaps most insidious involves how fairness beliefs affect negotiation effectiveness and outcomes. Fairness also creates what negotiation experts call concession cascade, where honest people give advantage. The fairness trap creates competitive naivety, where people misunderstand how success actually works. The fairness trap also creates what behavioral economists call sunk cost fallacy in moral investment. But there's something more sophisticated about how fairness affects social relationship dynamics. The fairness trap addresses what sociologists call moral authority illusion, where fairness creates false leadership. The fairness trap also exploits what psychologists call identity protection, where fairness becomes self-concept. But perhaps the most devastating aspect involves how fairness affects competitive positioning strategies. Understanding this trap doesn't mean abandoning all ethics, but recognizing competitive realities and requirements effectively. It means developing strategic thinking while maintaining core values where possible in competitive situations. If you want analysis of how competitive systems favor strategic players, subscribe to Prof. John Explained. Share this with someone who always follows rules perfectly.